Karen deliberately shoved the guardsman, confident that she would get away with it. But his unexpected reaction made the crowd freeze and left her regretting her actions. Let's start from the beginning. The sun shone brightly over Buckingham Palace, as if deliberately highlighting the traditional red uniforms of the Queen's Guard. Tourists swarmed the square like bees around a hive, each trying to capture the perfect shot on their phones. Laughter, shouts in various languages, and the clicking of cameras filled the air. It seemed as if the whole world had gathered here to witness a symbol of British resilience and tradition. On duty, standing motionless, was a guardsman, a man of about 30, fair-skinned and sturdy. His face, stern and focused, betrayed no emotion. He was the embodiment of honor, composure, and discipline, qualities sorely lacking in the chaotic modern world. His impeccably pressed red tunic stood out vividly against the gray stone of the palace. His bearskin hat made him appear even taller and more imposing. Tourists gazed at him with admiration, many wondering how he managed to remain so composed. And then, she appeared. Karen. This woman was impossible to miss. She was very heavy-set, with an excess of weight that seemed to occupy the space of several people. Her pink tracksuit glistened in the sunlight like plastic wrap, fitting so tightly it looked ready to burst. In one hand she held a soda cup the size of a bucket. In the other, a phone, which she was using to snap endless photos, seemingly aiming for the most ridiculous angles of the guardsman. Karen spoke loudly, not just loudly, but as if addressing the entire square. "Why doesn't he even move? This is ridiculous. Ha! What kind of job is this? Just standing there like a mannequin?" Her voice was dripping with mockery, loud enough to make some tourists glance over. But that only encouraged Karen. She lifted her head proudly, her face, smeared with poorly applied makeup, radiating smugness. Here, in front of the palace, she felt like royalty. "I'm the tourist here. I'm paying money to see a show," she declared defiantly, speaking not to anyone in particular, but as if addressing the whole world. She moved closer to one of the guardsmen. The crowd, captivated by what was unfolding, began to slow down, with some already pulling out their phones. Karen, noticing the growing attention, seemed to thrive on it. She stopped directly in front of the guardsman, looking at him with a smirk. "Why are you all so serious? It's just a costume," she shouted, as if trying to prove to everyone that she knew something they didn't. The guardsman didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed straight ahead, as if Karen were nothing more than a passing breeze, unworthy of acknowledgement. And that's when the real show began. Karen frowned. She wasn't used to being ignored. Her eyes sparkled with defiance, like a child denied their favorite toy. "Let's see how long you can stand there like a statue," she sneered with disdain. Some in the crowd began exchanging glances. Someone whispered, "Why is she doing this?" Others chuckled, perhaps finding her behavior amusing. But amidst the mix of reactions, a quiet disapproval began to ripple through the group. The guardsman, as solid as a stone statue, continued to stand his ground. His unshakable composure only emphasized the contrast between his dignity and Karen's absurd audacity. If you're thinking, why on earth is she behaving like this? This is too much. You're not alone. That question was written on the faces of everyone watching the scene unfold. Karen, however, continued her performance. She turned to the crowd and loudly asked, "Seriously? Can someone explain why he doesn't even smile? This is just a circus." The crowd fell silent again, the tension in the air becoming almost tangible. The guardsman seemed less like a man and more like a living monument to tradition, traditions that Karen's behavior was trampling on with every word and action. Having ensured she'd captured the crowd's attention, Karen began to feel like a true star. Her steps grew more confident, her voice louder, and her movements even sharper. She stood in front of the guardsman as if facing him in an arena, with the tourists and their phones serving as the audience. "Well, Mr. Red Soldier, do you really think you can keep ignoring me?" she sneered, leaning slightly forward. Her loud, sarcastic tone pierced the square's atmosphere, which had previously been filled with quiet admiration for the palace. Now, all eyes were on her, and she knew it. Karen crossed her arms on her hips and mockingly mimicked the guardsman's stance. "Oh, look at me. I'm so serious. Look at how I'm standing. No blinking, no moving," she exclaimed, freezing in an exaggerated parody. Her voice rose into a high-pitched, unnatural tone, as though she were trying to make the situation even more absurd. Some tourists in the crowd began to chuckle. A few found her behavior funny, but most looked uncomfortable. People exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. Someone whispered, "That's unacceptable," while another murmured, "Does she seriously not realize she's crossing the line?" But Karen kept her show going, relishing the attention her antics were receiving. "Hey, buddy, are you even alive? Or did your batteries die?" she shouted, raising an eyebrow and dramatically leaning in toward the guardsman's face. Her tone was so condescending it sounded as if she were addressing a child. The crowd started recording the scene with their phones. A few smiled, but their smiles were strained. The tension in the air was palpable. The guardsman, as always, remained utterly unshaken. He stood like a statue carved from stone, his composure only fueling Karen's growing frustration. She took another step forward, her bulky sneakers squeaking loudly against the cobblestones. Now she was close enough that the guardsman could smell the sugary scent of her soda as she spoke. "Come on. At least blink. You're a human, not a statue," Karen exclaimed, her voice echoing through the now silent crowd. But the guardsman didn't budge. His gaze remained fixed ahead, perfectly calm. The stark contrast between his regal silence and Karen's chaotic outbursts was almost comedic. Her face, however, began to flush deep red, a mix of anger and embarrassment. Determined to escalate further, Karen moved to the next level. Her hand, still clutching the giant soda cup, hovered near her face as she played with the edge of her straw, seemingly contemplating her next move. Then, with a deliberate motion, she raised her other hand and reached toward the guardsman's bearskin hat. "What happens if I touch this?" she asked, her tone dripping with challenge. The crowd gasped in unison. A man in a suit near the front called out, "Ma'am, you're not allowed to do that!" Another woman, standing with her child, added loudly, "That's so disrespectful." Rather than backing down, Karen smirked. Turning to the crowd, she laughed loudly and said, "Oh, what are they going to do? Arrest me for wanting to see what this ridiculous hat is made of?" Her laugh was loud but hollow, her eyes betraying her growing irritation. She was angry that her provocations hadn't elicited the reaction she wanted. The guardsman's unwavering stillness only added fuel to her frustration. Karen took another step closer, now almost face to face with the guardsman. Her sugary breath brushed against his face as she spoke. She reached out her hand again, pretending to touch his hat. This time her fingers were just inches away from the fabric. The crowd gasped again, and someone shouted, "That's enough!" But Karen only chuckled, her face twisting into a self-satisfied grin. "Let's see how much of a real soldier you are," she taunted, staring directly into the guardsman's eyes. Her actions radiated defiance, but were so foolish that the onlookers couldn't help but feel one overwhelming sentiment. Why is she doing this? The tension in the square had reached its peak. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, with whispers of disbelief and judgment rippling through the onlookers. Some tourists had already turned off their cameras, finding the scene too uncomfortable to watch, but many continued recording, eager to see how this bizarre confrontation would end. Frustrated by the guardsman's lack of reaction, Karen decided to escalate her behavior. Her face, flushed with a mix of irritation and smugness, twisted into a sly grin. Shaking her oversized soda cup, she took a few exaggerated steps forward. "Well, Mr. Stoneface, do you even realize I'm here for entertainment? Or did they take your tongue along with your sense of humor?" she called out, her voice ringing across the square. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some tourists looked visibly offended, while others continued filming, sensing this might turn into a viral moment. Karen stopped directly in front of the guardsman, staring at him with a challenging look. Then, as if by accident, she tilted her soda cup slightly, letting a few sticky drops fall onto the cobblestones at his feet. Gasping theatrically, she covered her mouth with her hand and exclaimed, "Oh no, I'm so sorry. That doesn't break your precious protocol, does it?" The crowd froze. Some winced at the blatant disrespect, while others shook their heads in disbelief, murmuring, "How could she do that?" Karen, however, seemed oblivious. Her arrogant smirk widened as she realized all eyes were now on her. The guardsman, standing like an immovable statue, remained composed. His face didn't twitch, and his gaze stayed fixed straight ahead. Yet the tension in the air was almost tangible, as if the entire scene had paused in anticipation of what might happen next. "Ma'am, stop! You're crossing the line!" Someone from the crowd shouted, their voice tense, as if they feared making things worse. Karen turned sharply, her expression flashing with irritation. "Oh, you're all so boring!" she snapped, waving her hand dismissively like swatting away an annoying fly. "I'm a tourist. I paid money for this, so I have the right to have a little fun." Her self-confidence was almost palpable. Taking another step forward, she hovered at the edge of the white line marking the boundary no one was allowed to cross. Leaning even closer to the guardsman, only a few inches separated them now. "And what happens if I do this?" she asked, stretching her arm forward and shoving his shoulder with her hand. The push wasn't hard, but it was enough for the crowd to collectively gasp. A wave of whispers rippled through the onlookers. Did she just push him? The guardsman remained standing as solidly as ever. His body swayed slightly from the impact but immediately steadied, his composure unbroken. His unwavering focus seemed almost superhuman, a testament to his training and discipline. The crowd began to voice their outrage more openly. A woman in an elegant hat turned to her companion and said loudly enough for others to hear, "That's absolutely disgusting. How dare she behave like that?" Others, however, laughed and encouraged Karen. "Go on, do something else. Give us a real show," they jeered. The mix of condemnation and provocation only heightened the tension. Spurred on by the encouragement of a small but vocal part of the crowd, Karen turned back to the guardsman. Her eyes gleamed with a mix of anger and satisfaction, thrilled to be the center of attention. "What's the matter? Still standing there like a statue? Are you even human?" she taunted, leaning so close her face was almost at his ear. The silence in the square was now oppressive. The guardsman stood firm, a living embodiment of honor and tradition, which Karen continued to mock with reckless abandon. His steadfastness commanded respect from those watching, even as Karen's behavior grew increasingly brazen. But her lack of impact only fueled her irritation. She took yet another step forward, teetering on the edge of the boundary. Her heavy breathing and exaggerated gestures revealed her determination to push things even further. As Karen hovered on the brink of crossing the line, the atmosphere around her felt like it could snap at any moment. The crowd held its breath, unsure of what would happen next, but knowing it wouldn't end well for her. The noisy crowd fell silent in an instant. The sound of the shove, though faint, pierced the tense atmosphere like a needle popping a balloon. Karen had pushed the guardsman, and his imposing figure swayed slightly backward. It was a brief moment, but it felt as though time had frozen. The guardsman, clad in his majestic red tunic, nearly lost his balance, but quickly recovered. His feet, seemingly rooted to the ground, held him firmly in place. Even in this critical moment, his posture remained impeccable, but his expression changed. Where moments ago it had been an emotionless mask, his eyes now reflected a subtle but undeniable determination. And then he moved. It was a single step forward, but its sharpness and precision were like the release of a spring long held under tension. The guardsman raised his head slightly higher, and in that moment, he seemed more than human. A living embodiment of strength and honor, as if the very spirit of Britain stood before them. His voice, deep and commanding, thundered across the square like a clap of lightning. "Step back! You are violating protocol!" The shout was so unexpected that Karen instinctively recoiled, stepping back in surprise. Her eyes widened, and her face flashed with a mix of shock and fear. For a moment she stood frozen, as if unable to believe that this man, whom she had dismissed as a living mannequin, could produce such a powerful sound. But Karen quickly regained her composure. Her face twisted back into a defiant sneer, and she spread her arms wide as if trying to reclaim control of the situation. "What? You seriously think you can yell at me?" she snapped, her voice shrill and full of indignation. The crowd remained still, their whispers barely audible over the tension in the air. "I'm a tourist. I came here to have fun, and you're supposed to provide it," Karen continued, her tone becoming more hysterical as she gestured wildly, trying to draw the crowd back to her side. But the atmosphere in the square had shifted. The once curious onlookers were now exchanging judgmental glances and murmurs of disapproval. A woman in an elegant hat spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "This is disgraceful. She doesn't understand that the guards are not some sort of performance." Another tourist added, "She needs to stop. This has gone way too far." Even under the growing pressure of the crowd, Karen refused to back down. She turned to one of her critics and snapped, "You're all so boring. I'm here to have fun. This is just their job." Her words were defiant, but her tone was increasingly desperate, as though she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. At that moment, a tall man in a crisp security uniform emerged from the crowd. His confident strides were audible even above the murmurs. He was a palace security officer, fair-skinned and sharp-featured, with a serious expression that left no room for argument. "Ma'am, you are disturbing public order. We must ask you to leave the premises," he said firmly, his voice calm but unyielding, like iron. His demeanor was enough to make even the boldest person reconsider their actions. Karen froze. Her mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came out. For a moment she looked completely lost, her face shifting rapidly from shock to anger. Finally, she managed to stammer, "What? I didn't do anything wrong." But her voice wavered, lacking the confidence she had displayed earlier. The guard remained motionless, his stern gaze conveying that excuses would not work. He repeated, "Ma'am, please come with me. Your behavior is unacceptable." And then the crowd came alive. Applause started tentatively but quickly grew louder. People clapped, some cheering, "That's right," and "Serves her right." Smiles spread across faces, and a few burst into laughter. The atmosphere shifted completely, now filled with a sense of justice and satisfaction. Karen, now the focus of judgment rather than admiration, looked deflated. Her face alternated between pale and flushed as her eyes darted between the security guard and the crowd, searching desperately for support, but finding none. Her show had ended, but not in the way she had hoped. Meanwhile, the guardsman, who had remained steadfast throughout the ordeal, calmly resumed his position. His unshakable composure, strength, and dignity left an indelible impression on those who had witnessed the spectacle. In their eyes, he had become more than a soldier. He was a symbol of resilience and grace in the face of chaos. Karen tried to act as if she still had control of the situation. Her face, which had once radiated smug confidence, now showed a mix of anger and confusion. Her eyes darted between the guards, the crowd, and the guardsman, who remained unshakable, standing firm like a stone pillar despite everything. "It was just a joke! Don't you people have a sense of humor?" she shouted, her voice loud but tinged with panic. She wanted to appear confident, but her tense shoulders and trembling hands betrayed her unease. Her words, instead of diffusing the tension, only fueled more laughter. Someone in the crowd snorted and shouted, "A joke? More like a circus, lady!" Another voice chimed in, "She's the joke now. Just look at her." Karen turned toward the crowd, desperately seeking support. Her face flushed even deeper as she noticed dozens of phones pointed at her, recording her every move and word. People were smiling, laughing, and whispering among themselves. Someone yelled, "Hey, Karen, give us a wave! You're a star now!" The sarcastic remark seemed to finally rattle Karen, her face contorted with rage. "I'm a tourist! I paid money to be here! This is for me! You're all just jealous!" she shrieked, her voice rising higher and louder. Yet there was no trace of confidence left, just desperation. Meanwhile, the guards moved in, calm but firm. One of them gently but firmly took hold of her arm. "Ma'am, please come with us. You are being escorted off palace grounds," he said in a measured, professional tone. His voice was steady, devoid of anger, yet so authoritative that even the most stubborn person would think twice before arguing. "You can't do this! I didn't do anything wrong!" Karen yelled, twisting in their grip, but her movements were clumsy and pitiful. She tried to pull away, but the guards, without exerting unnecessary force, skillfully guided her toward the exit. The crowd, which had been silent moments before, came alive. Applause started softly, but quickly grew into a roaring ovation. People clapped, whistled, and some shouted, "Good job!" and "Serves her right!" The atmosphere shifted dramatically. What had once been a divided audience, some amused, others shocked, now felt unified in their sense of justice. "Disgraceful! She needs to learn some respect," said an elderly woman standing with her daughter and grandson. A young man filming the scene on his phone added sarcastically, "Well, she's definitely famous now, just not in the way she wanted." Karen heard the remark. Her face twisted in fury as she glared at the young man. "You don't even know what you're talking about! You're all hypocrites!" she yelled, but her words fell flat. No one took her seriously anymore. By then, the guards had led her to the edge of the square, where 2 police officers waited. The officers, tall and composed, stood silently, their stern expressions making it clear that the show was over. Karen noticed them and froze for a moment, as though calculating her next move. But whatever she had planned, it no longer mattered. As Karen attempted to argue with the guards, the crowd began returning to their activities. However, conversations about the incident buzzed across the square. "I've never seen anything like that before," said a man holding a camera. His companion added, "I feel bad for the guardsman. Imagine having to deal with that and still keeping your composure." Meanwhile, a few people were already uploading videos of the spectacle to social media. Captions ranged from, "Karen humiliates herself in front of Buckingham Palace guard," to, "How not to act at Buckingham Palace." Others in the crowd chuckled as they read the first comments rolling in. Some speculated on how quickly the video would go viral. Amid all the commotion, the guardsman who had endured the chaos returned to his standard position. His stillness, composure, and quiet strength were nothing short of remarkable. Once again, he became the embodiment of dignity and professionalism. His gaze remained fixed forward, as though none of this had ever happened. But for those who witnessed it, he became something more than just a guardsman. He was a symbol of grace under pressure, a reminder that true strength lies in maintaining dignity and honor, even when chaos swirls around you. The square in front of Buckingham Palace gradually returned to its usual rhythm. The crowd, which had been buzzing with excitement over the incident with Karen just moments ago, now shifted its focus back to cameras, photographs, and the slow-paced spectacle of the changing of the guard. The guardsman, as if nothing had happened, adjusted his bearskin hat, slightly turned his head, and resumed his stance. His face regained the stern yet calm stillness he had maintained all day. But now, he was more than just part of the royal scenery. To those who had witnessed the commotion, he became a symbol of unyielding resilience and the embodiment of British discipline. A man in a gray coat remarked respectfully, "That's what true composure looks like. We could all learn something from that." The woman next to him nodded, adding, "He's not just a man, he's an example." Tourists, inspired by his poise, began approaching for photos. However, this time they did so with a newfound respect, staying behind the white line, whispering so as not to disrupt the atmosphere, and carefully keeping their distance. A young boy standing with his father exclaimed in awe, "Dad, I want to be just like him someday." The father smiled and softly replied, "Then you'll need to learn patience, son." Meanwhile, Karen, loudly escorted off the square by security, had vanished beyond the palace grounds. But her presence lingered, not as a person, but as a memory of the chaos she had created and the humiliation she had brought upon herself. On social media, videos of her antics were already gaining traction. In the comments, people were condemning her behavior. Another Karen publicly embarrassing herself. When will they learn to respect other cultures? One user wrote. Another comment, which received hundreds of likes, read, "The guardsman is the real hero here. He showed how to stay dignified even when everything around you is a mess." The memes followed soon after. One featured Karen's rage-contorted face alongside the caption, "When you think the world revolves around you, but it doesn't." Another showed the stone-faced guardsman with the words, "Unshaken, even when there's a hurricane named Karen." Back in Karen's personal life, her friends and acquaintances who had seen the video started weighing in on her actions. One sarcastic comment left under a post read, "Well done, Karen. Great way to get famous. Though I'm not sure it's the kind of fame you were hoping for." Her phone was likely buzzing nonstop with calls and messages, but they were probably not from people offering their support. For many, Karen had come to represent modern entitlement and selfishness, the very traits that erode respect for traditions and culture. Her actions inspired neither sympathy nor understanding, only laughter and disapproval. Meanwhile, the guardsman, having resumed his usual stance, looked as though he hadn't even noticed the uproar. His focused gaze, fixed on a point far away, reminded onlookers of something greater than mere duty. He stood as a living testament to honor, tradition, and dignity, qualities unshaken by provocation or disrespect.